The first time the pipes answered me, I thought someone was trapped inside the steel walls. But the voice that rose through the vibration didn't belong to anything human. Working on the North Sea oil rig means living by 11 rules that keep you alive, even if no one explains why. I learned quickly that breaking even one of them can turn the entire rig against you. I still remember the moment I ignored the warning about the lower decks. The air felt charged, like something was waiting for me to slip again. And the worst part is, I'm starting to think the pipes recognize me now, and they're waiting for another mistake. I learned Rule 1, never enter the lower deck. When the pipes are breathing on my first night shift, back when I still believed half the warnings on this rig were just old-timer superstition. The phrase sounded strange to me, almost poetic in a way, but the others said it with a seriousness that made my skin tighten. They insisted the pipes breathe, though no one ever explained what that meant, and I was too new to challenge it. Still, the rules stuck in my mind like a thorn the moment I descended those steel stairs alone. I remember how the hallway felt wider than it should have been, as if the shadows were stretching just to make room for me. The overhead lights gave off a faint trembling glow, not flickering, just unsure. The metal beneath my boots felt warmer than the rest of the rig, like something had heated it from inside. I told myself the boilers were running a bit hot, maybe the pressure lines were expanding, but that didn't explain why the air carried a slow rhythmic swell, almost like a living inhale. I stopped halfway down the corridor when I felt the faint push of air brushing my neck, warm enough to leave my skin damp. For a second I thought someone was behind me, maybe Dave messing around, or maybe the ventilation system had kicked in unexpectedly. But the vents above me were still, and the air didn't feel like a draft from machinery. It felt like something standing close, too close, exhaling softly enough that I could feel it on the back of my ear. The deeper I went, the more the walls seemed to tremble, not violently but softly, as if they were responding to my steps. I kept my flashlight low, letting the beam sweep along the pipes hugging the ceiling and walls. The bolts holding them in place looked slightly looser than I remembered from inspection, almost widened as if something inside had pushed outward. I tried telling myself expansion and pressure could do that, but the geometry didn't match. These bolts weren't stretching from force, they looked pulled. As I approached the junction where the auxiliary units were housed, the rhythmic swell of the air grew more deliberate, not louder, not faster, just deliberate, like something aware of me was adjusting its cadence. My boots sounded too sharp on the steel, each step echoing so far it felt like someone else was walking beside me, trying to match my rhythm, and almost succeeding. I tightened my grip on the wrench I'd brought, though I had no idea what I thought it would protect me from. When I reached the end of the corridor, the temperature dropped so suddenly it made me pull my jacket tighter without thinking. The warmth from earlier had vanished, leaving only a brittle chill that clung to my clothes. The pipes around the corner expanded slightly, just a subtle shift, like the gentle rise of a chest. I stood frozen, afraid that if I moved, whatever was inside them would move too. My breath felt loud in my throat, and I forced myself to steady it so it wouldn't sink with that quiet, steady pulse echoing through the metal. I heard something then, not a knock, not a clang, nothing sharp or mechanical. It was a deep, dragging shift inside the pipes, like something turning slowly, scraping softly along the inner walls. My flashlight dimmed for a moment, as if the power stuttered, and in the low light I could swear the pipe nearest me had widened by a fraction of an inch. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when the light strengthened again, the metal looked subtly reshaped. I took one step back, and the pipes reacted, not violently, not aggressively, just noticeably. The nearest one seemed to pull tighter, as if contracting. The air between us felt charged with some faint static, like the moment before touching an electrified fence. I swallowed hard and whispered to myself that it was time to leave, that maybe the others weren't superstitious after all. But before I turned, I heard a faint shift inside the overhead line, a slow sliding sound, like something was repositioning itself closer to where I stood. The urge to run hit so suddenly it nearly knocked the breath out of me, but I forced myself to move slowly, a single careful step at a time. The corridor behind me looked darker than when I'd entered, the shadows pooling together as if forming shapes I didn't want to understand. The rhythmic swell of air seemed to follow me, softer now, almost disappointed. I walked backward at first, not wanting to turn my back on the breathing walls, but the dimming lights made me pivot faster than I intended. As I retraced my steps, the air warmed again, rising gently against my neck, not as a threat, but almost as an acknowledgement, like whatever was down there recognized that I'd understood something I wasn't meant to. My boots felt heavier, each step dragging slightly, as if the metal walkway wanted to hold on to the soles. I kept my eyes fixed on the ladder leading back up, telling myself that once I reached the top, I could pretend none of this happened. When I finally grabbed the rung and pulled myself upward, I felt the faintest vibration run through the metal, rising from below like a final exhale. I didn't look down. I climbed faster than I ever had, my breath shaking despite trying to steady it. By the time I reached the upper deck, my hands were trembling so badly, I almost dropped my wrench. The others were waiting near the maintenance cabin, watching me with a look that wasn't curiosity, it was confirmation. Dave stepped forward, eyes widening slightly, as he noticed the sheen of sweat across my forehead. He didn't ask what I'd seen. He didn't have to. He just nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, almost resigned. "You went down there while it was awake, didn't you?" he said, and the way he said awake made something inside my stomach twist. I didn't answer, but he didn't wait for one. He placed a hand on my shoulder, not to comfort me, but to steady me, like he knew my legs were moments away from giving out. "Consider yourself lucky," he added, "because most people don't make it back up the first time they hear it breathing." The others nodded, not with fear, but with a kind of grim understanding, their eyes flicking briefly toward the lower deck, as if expecting something to follow. And before I could ask any questions, before I could even process what had happened, the rig groaned, a deep, slow sound that felt like it came from beneath our feet. All of them went silent instantly. Dave's grip tightened on my shoulder. He took a single breath and said quietly, "You need to see something, and I hope to hell you're ready." I first understood Rule 2. Never look directly into the reflection, unless you're ready to see what's behind you during the third week of my rotation. After working 12-hour shifts with the lower decks, still fresh in my memory, I had assumed the warnings about mirrors, polished panels, and visor reflections were the kind of exaggerations oil rig veterans tell newbies to scare them straight. But the steel corridors of the rig don't lie, and the reflective surfaces here aren't just mirrors. They are traps, windows into something that watches and waits. That first evening as I passed the maintenance bay, the overhead lights glimmered off the metal piping, creating a sheen that drew my eyes in before I realized what I was doing. The corridor was silent, except for the low hum of the rig's pumps, but in the reflective panels along the walls, I saw my own face, sharp and pale, almost frozen with exhaustion. I reached for the first panel to wipe the fog, and that's when it happened. My reflection didn't move in sync. My hand raised slowly, and the mirrored image remained motionless, its eyes wide, unblinking, almost mocking. I froze, stomach twisting, and whispered under my breath, That's impossible." The reflection tilted its head slightly, watching me, patient, and I felt an immediate icy dread crawl down my spine. I told myself it must be a trick of the dim lights, shadows twisting the reflections, or the fatigue messing with my perception. But then, as I stepped closer, I noticed subtle differences, the faint tension in the mirrored shoulders, the way the eyes followed me too precisely, as if they were separate from my own. I had read the old logs about accidents, disappearances, and strange reports of hallucinations, but nothing prepared me for this. The reflection was alive, aware. I realized then that ignoring Rule 2 wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous, perhaps even deadly. I backed away slowly, careful not to break eye contact completely, and the reflection mimicked me in the smallest possible ways, almost teasing me. The corridor suddenly felt longer, stretching unnaturally toward the end, where the observation deck led out over the turbulent sea. Every step I took echoed, but the reflection didn't echo with me. It stayed sharp, precise, unnervingly calm, as if judging me for approaching too closely. I could hear the subtle vibration of pipes beneath the floor, reminiscent of the lower deck, and my hands tightened around the wrench I carried, though it offered no comfort. As I reached the corner, the reflection shifted slightly, but in a way I didn't. The tilting of the head, the faint smile that seemed to grow as my own lips stayed neutral, it was deliberate. My chest tightened, and I realized I hadn't even been breathing consciously. The rig's constant hum felt louder now, almost like it was responding to my fear. I took a step back, eyes darting, trying to avoid the gaze that felt too heavy, too insistent. Something in that reflection knew I was afraid, and the knowledge made me shiver all over. I reminded myself again that this was Rule 2 in action. The rule wasn't meant to punish me, it was meant to protect me. Reflections here weren't just surfaces, they were layers, portals, tests. I could feel them, see the depth behind the superficial shine, where shadows swirled and patterns moved independently of the rig's natural lines. One of the other mechanics had joked about seeing the other you during the night shift, but I now understood it was no joke. What waits behind the surface doesn't wait forever. It waits until you falter, until curiosity outweighs caution. My first instinct was to call for help, but even the comms felt off. Static buzzed faintly, as if carrying an unspoken warning. I tried to move faster, turning toward the observation deck, where other team members were supposed to be, but the corridor stretched impossibly, the reflective panels multiplying the view of myself over and over. Each mirror seemed to take a piece of me, bending it into something wrong, something aware, something waiting. I swallowed hard and murmured, "Keep moving, just don't look." My own voice sounded distant, distorted, yet the reflection's lips moved in perfect sync, mocking me still. I reached the maintenance ladder to climb toward the deck, shaking. Every inch of metal felt colder than it should, every shadow too black, every reflection too sharp. I glanced briefly at one panel to check my footing, and the mirrored me was already staring straight at me with a glint I could not recognize in my own eyes. A flash of movement in the background made me whip my head around, but the deck was empty. Nothing, only the reflection, smiling slowly, knowingly. My heart hammered. I realized that ignoring Rule 2 even momentarily could be fatal. I took a deep breath and focused on the ladder, climbing as fast as I dared. The panel next to me reflected a perfect version of myself, but I knew it wasn't real. Each rung I ascended felt heavier, like the weight of something unseen pressing from below. I imagined the reflection waiting, ready to step out if I faltered. My palms were slick on the metal, and the dim rig lights felt oppressive, reflecting off the polished surfaces with a faint, almost malicious gleam. Every movement felt tracked, every glance measured. Finally, I reached the top deck. I collapsed against the railing, breathing hard, watching the churning North Sea beneath the rig. The wind bit at my face. The night sky was jagged with clouds, and the rig's metal groaned faintly, as if in approval or acknowledgement of my survival. I told no one about the reflection, but the memory of its deliberate, calculated gaze stayed with me. I knew from that moment onward that the rule was not optional. Rule 2 existed for a reason, and the reflection was patient, waiting. Later I spoke quietly with Dave, who had noticed the pallor on my face. "Did you go near the observation corridor?" he asked, voice low. I nodded, swallowing. He didn't respond immediately, but glanced at the polished panels near the edge of the deck, and his eyes flickered nervously. "Some things," he said finally, "you only see once, and when you do, you don't get a second chance to unsee them." I understood exactly what he meant. The reflection had seen me, studied me, and now it would follow me, not physically, but in every reflective surface, in every shiny panel I passed. I stayed on the upper deck the rest of the night, refusing to move into any corridors with reflective surfaces, willing my eyes to stay forward and my mind to focus on the waves. I kept imagining the reflection smile, precise, cold and unending, and the shiver it sent down my spine was nothing compared to the fear that I might see it again. Every polished bolt, every small puddle of water, every metallic surface became a potential gateway, a window into a presence I could not escape. I whispered to myself that survival was an obedience, that every rule mattered, that Rule 2 had just saved me from something I could not comprehend. Hours later, as the sun began to lift over the horizon and paint the waves in pale light, I moved cautiously back to my quarters, eyes fixed on the unreflective metal floors. Every instinct told me not to glance at the panels, the glass, the polished doors, and somewhere deep in the rig, I knew the reflection was waiting, patient, silent and aware that the next person who ignored Rule 2 might not be so lucky. I learned Rule 3. Never touch the pipes. When the temperature drops without warning the hard way. Just a few days after surviving the reflection in the observation corridor, that night I was running a routine inspection of the rig's auxiliary lines, trying to reassure myself that I wasn't imagining anything down here. The North Sea wind was lashing against the steel superstructure, rattling the deck plates, but inside the rig, the air had a strange static stillness. The pipes along the lower deck gleamed under the dim floodlights, and I could see my breath misting in sudden clouds that seemed to appear and vanish too quickly, as though the rig itself was exhaling. The first time I touched a pipe that was cold to the point of pain, a shiver ran up my arm, startling me so badly, I almost dropped my wrench. I had known about temperature variations, but this was unnatural, too abrupt, too precise. The metal beneath my gloves felt alive, as if a heartbeat pulsed through the steel. I told myself it was a quirk of the system, maybe a sudden coolant shift or pressure vent. But then I realized the chill wasn't just on my gloves. It spread in a creeping wave up my arm and into my chest. I froze, my knuckles white against the pipe, and tried to pull away, but my grip felt like it had been subtly pulled inward. The corridor lights dimmed as the temperature dropped further, shadows stretching along the steel. I could hear the faint vibration of distant pumps, irregular now, as if the rig itself was reacting to my touch. My mind raced, remembering the warnings of the older mechanics. Some pipes carried more than just oil or water. They carried the rig's memory, its awareness. I had been told these anomalies were unpredictable, and that touching the pipes when the temperature shifted suddenly was asking for something I didn't want to name. My breathing became shallow as I tried to rationalize the sensation, convincing myself I was imagining it, until the pipe beneath my gloves jolted lightly, almost like a pulse. I pulled my hands back, but the chill lingered, wrapping around my arms and fingers in an insistent grip. The air itself seemed denser, thicker, like it had been stirred by some presence along the lines. I could hear faint creaks and groans echoing through the deck, though nothing above ground appeared to move. A whisper of wind, or maybe a whisper from the rig, brushed past my ear and I spun around, expecting to see a colleague, a shadow, anything. But I was alone, and only the pipes waited, cold and calculating, humming in silence that felt almost sentient. I reminded myself again that this was Rule 3, and that ignoring it could have consequences I couldn't yet comprehend. Yet part of me, stubborn and desperate to understand, leaned closer to the cold steel. The instant I touched it again, the temperature seemed to dive even further, like the metal had somehow absorbed all warmth from the air around it. I felt a subtle vibration travel through my fingertips, spreading upward in waves along my arms. It wasn't mechanical, it was something else, something alive and aware that I had dared to break the rule even briefly. I tried stepping back, but the lower deck felt unnaturally elongated, the far end of the corridor stretching beyond its normal length. The dim floodlights flickered as if hesitating, shadows dancing across the floor in unnatural patterns. I felt watched. No, not watched. Tested. Every time my hand left the metal, the pipe seemed to react, a slight hum, a tightening of the surrounding bolts, a whisper of energy that pressed against my skin like a living weight. I realized that unlike the reflections from the previous rule, this presence responded to direct contact, learning, judging, punishing. My breath came in rapid bursts as I took careful steps backward, trying to break the connection with the living metal. But the vibration persisted, trailing along the corridor like a lingering heartbeat. I could see my reflection in the polished pipe surfaces, distorted now, darker than it should have been. My own image seemed warped, elongated, as though the pipes had altered it in some imperceptible way. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run to the upper deck, but my legs felt leaden, weighed down by dread. As I moved toward the exit, the cold shifted suddenly, a wave that rose from the floor to the ceiling, brushing against my skin like icy fingers. The longer I stayed near the pipes, the more oppressive the weight became, as if they were tethering me, reminding me why Rule 3 existed. I could hear faint murmurs, impossible to distinguish, but they're nonetheless, like dozens of tiny voices echoing along the steel. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, just the rig settling, but the pressure against my chest and arms said otherwise. I finally reached the ladder leading to the upper deck, climbing as quickly as I could without losing my grip. My gloves were damp with condensation from the extreme cold, and every rung felt as if it wanted to hold me, to slow me down. When I emerged onto the open deck, the wind was a relief, bitter and sharp against my face, but freedom felt temporary. I knew the cold beneath the pipes would persist, lingering in my bones, reminding me that this was not a normal metal structure. It was a living, reacting entity. Dave was waiting near the cabin entrance, noticing my pallor immediately. "You were on the lower deck," he said quietly, voice low, almost cautious. I nodded, still trembling. "Yeah," I admitted, "and the pipes, something was wrong. They reacted to me." He didn't argue. He had seen it before, I realized, though he didn't need to explain. Some things here didn't need explanation, they just needed obedience. As the sun began to rise over the steel horizon of the North Sea, painting the waves in faint gold, I knew one truth. Rule 3 was a safeguard, and the pipes were alive in ways I could barely comprehend. If I touched them again without warning, the consequences would escalate. The rig wasn't just a platform, it was an entity, aware of me, aware of every mistake, waiting for the next time curiosity outweighed caution, and I knew deep down that some mistakes might be unforgivable. I first heard Rule 4: do not follow any footsteps that don't match anyone on the shift roster. On a night when the rig felt emptier than usual, even though I knew every bunk was occupied. After what happened with the pipes, I'd been trying to convince myself that the worst was behind me, but the rig has layers, steel decks that hold memories, corridors that echo with more than wind, and footsteps that don't belong to anyone alive. That evening, I was walking toward the maintenance cabin when a faint series of footsteps drifted down the hall behind me. They were slow, steady, too measured to be accidental, and I immediately sensed something wrong. The shift roster had only 3 of us awake at that hour, and neither Dave nor Miller moved like that. The footsteps continued with the same rhythm, as though whoever or whatever made them was purposefully keeping distance between us. I stopped, expecting the sound to stop too, but the steps carried on for 3 more beats before fading into a silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. Something inside me tightened. I turned around, half hoping to see one of the guys playing a joke, but the corridor stretched empty all the way to the last bulkhead door. The overhead lights flickered, the faint buzzing growing louder for a moment before settling again, and the steel floor beneath my boots felt warmer than usual, like someone had passed there just seconds earlier. I tried convincing myself it was echoes, vibrations, anything that made sense, but the pattern of those steps was too precise to ignore. I took a few cautious steps backward, keeping my eyes on the corridor, waiting to hear them again. The rig often shifts with the tide, but those noises are scattered and uneven. This rhythm had intent. When nothing else followed, I forced myself to continue toward the maintenance cabin, though each step felt heavier than the last. My mind replayed the rule: don't follow footsteps that don't match anyone on shift. It wasn't just a warning, it was a boundary, something put in place to stop us from being lured somewhere we weren't meant to go. But as I walked, the air behind me seemed to tighten, as if the footsteps were still there, watching, waiting for me to slip. By the time I reached the cabin, my palms were slick with sweat. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, relieved to see normalcy: tools scattered across the bench, coffee mugs left out from earlier, the faint hum of equipment running through the walls. Dave glanced up from his binder, raising an eyebrow when he saw my expression. "You hear them, didn't you?" he asked. His voice was calm, but his eyes stayed focused, searching my face for confirmation. I didn't need to answer. "They always try the new guys first," he added quietly, flipping a page without reading it. "They're testing how you react." I wanted to ask what exactly was following me, but something in his tone told me it wouldn't help. Whatever those footsteps belonged to, knowing wouldn't change anything. Before I could respond, the overhead lights dimmed, then steadied again, and a faint metallic groan traveled through the cabin floor. Dave looked up, eyes narrowing. "Stay here," he said, pushing himself upright. "If you hear the steps again, don't acknowledge them. Don't look, don't answer, and don't move toward them, no matter what." His voice left no room for argument, but I hated the idea of being left alone so soon after hearing them. He stepped out into the corridor, and the door swung shut behind him, leaving me with the soft drone of machinery and my own uneven breathing. I stood still, listening to the cabin walls expand and contract with the shifting pressure. Minutes passed. Then, faintly at first, the footsteps returned. This time they were closer, much closer. They approached slowly along the hallway outside, each step deliberate, as though the walker knew exactly where I was. My heart began to race as the sound stopped directly in front of the cabin door. The door's shadow shifted slightly, as if something large stood on the other side. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the workbench until my knuckles numbed. The handle didn't move, but the silence felt suffocating, stretching thinner and thinner. A soft pressure pushed against the doorframe, too subtle to be forceful, but unmistakably intentional, like a hand resting there, waiting. The footsteps didn't continue, but I felt their weight, the presence behind them, as if whatever stood there was considering me. When the pressure finally lifted, I stayed frozen for several seconds. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away in the same slow rhythm, each one fading a little more until the corridor fell silent again. The moment they vanished, my knees weakened. I sank onto the stool beside the bench, my breath shaky, the silence inside the cabin suddenly too loud to bear. I checked the shift roster again, even though I already knew the truth. No one else was awake, and no one walked like that. Dave returned 10 minutes later, closing the door firmly behind him. He didn't say a word at first. He just walked to the tool rack, grabbed a pair of insulated gloves, and tossed them onto the bench. "There's a reason we don't follow," he said finally, without turning around. "They lead you to places you won't come back from, places that weren't built for us." He paused, then added, "Places that move when you're not looking." His words settled heavily between us, and I realized the footsteps weren't random. They had purpose. I wanted to ask where the footsteps had come from, or what they wanted, but a part of me already understood. Some parts of the rig weren't entirely man-made anymore. Something else had claimed them, moving through the steel like an echo with intent. And if we followed, willingly or not, we'd cross into spaces that didn't belong on the map. Spaces the rig tolerated, but didn't control. That night, as I made my way back to the bunk room, I kept my ears sharp and my steps slow. The corridors felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, as though something unseen had shifted the geometry of the decks, stretching them or bending the angles of the hallways. I reached my bunk without hearing the footsteps again, but the silence was cruel, heavy, expectant, pregnant with the possibility they would return. The moment I closed my eyes, lying in the dim light, I understood why the older workers spoke about the rules in hushed tones. The footsteps were not simply sounds, they were invitations from something that navigated the rig differently than we did. Something that lived beneath the steel, between the pipes, inside the vibrations, and it wanted us to follow. The only thing stopping us was obedience and fear. I turned on my side, the bunk creaking beneath me, and stared at the thin curtain that separated my narrow space from the hallway. For a long time nothing moved. Then somewhere in the distance, faint and deliberate, I heard them again, slow steps moving through a section of the rig. No one should have been walking at that hour. My breath hitched as I understood. The footsteps weren't searching anymore. They already knew where my bunk was. I first understood Rule 5. Never override the safety valves. During a storm on a night when the North Sea winds tore against the rig, like a pack of wild animals, shaking the entire structure until it groaned under the pressure. That evening I was performing routine checks on the main pipeline, clipboard in hand, trying to steady my shaking legs on the slick metal walkway. The floodlights outside threw everything into stark contrast. Black waves, white foam, and the trembling steel of the rig beneath me. I remembered the warnings from the veteran mechanics, but arrogance and fatigue had dulled my caution. Overriding a valve seemed like a small risk, a calculated action that I could control. The storm intensified as I approached the valve, a thin layer of seawater forming along the walkway, mixing with the condensation from the freezing pipes. My gloves felt slick against the metal, and I could feel my heartbeat echoing in my ears as the rig trembled. I knew the safety valves were calibrated precisely for these conditions, but the thought that the pressure could be redirected for a quicker fix lingered in my mind. I hesitated, briefly recalling the rule, the words echoing in my head, never override them. But the temptation of control, of being able to manipulate the rig's heartbeat, was overwhelming. As I grasped the valve handle, a sudden lurch threw me sideways against the piping, a violent reminder of the storm's raw power. I staggered, nearly losing my grip, and the wind ripped through the corridors, carrying with it the faint, distant roar of waves smashing against the rig's supports. My vision narrowed as adrenaline surged, the storm outside now feeling almost alive, an entity pressing against the rig, testing its defenses. I clenched my jaw, reminded again of the rule I was about to defy, and hesitated. Every instinct screamed to let go, but my hands stayed frozen on the valve. I tried to reason with myself, convinced I could manage the situation, that I understood the mechanics well enough to avoid catastrophe. My fingers slipped slightly on the wet metal as the storm's fury rattled the rig, and the pipes nearby hummed with a low vibration. It wasn't mechanical, it was anticipatory, as though the rig itself was warning me against interference. I froze, listening to the deep, throbbing hum reverberating through the steel. It was subtle at first, a vibration under my palms, but then it grew stronger, traveling along the pipelines, echoing across the deck, warning me. The wind seemed to push closer, as if reaching for me through the thin walls, and I imagined the storm itself watching my every movement. Lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating the ocean in stark white, revealing the rig's trembling frame and the churning waves below. My hands shook as I wrestled with the valve handle, each movement amplified by the tremors of the rig. I realized with dawning horror that overriding the valve could destabilize the system entirely, turning the storm from a natural enemy into a deadly force magnified by human error. I tried to step back, but the walkway beneath me shifted subtly, and the pipes around the valve seemed to tighten, as though the rig was aware of my intent. The vibration grew to a low, threatening pulse, resonating in my chest and hands. I felt small, fragile, insignificant compared to the rig and the storm outside. The steel walls around me shivered as if alive, and I understood that the rules weren't arbitrary, they were survival. Ignoring them meant inviting the rig's wrath, and in that moment, I saw clearly why no one dared to override the valves during a storm. A sudden blast of wind threw me against the valve again, and the handle moved slightly in my grip, forcing a hiss of pressurized air from the pipes. My eyes widened as I realized the near catastrophe I had caused. The vibration intensified, and the pipes groaned, almost like a voice warning me to stop. I could feel the metal around me pulse in rhythm with the storm, and the presence of the rig became palpable, an intelligent, reactive entity that did not forgive mistakes. I remembered the other rules, the reflections, the pipes, the footsteps, and understood they were all connected. The rig was alive in ways I could not fully comprehend. I released the valve handle with a shaking hand, stumbling backward as the storm outside seemed to roar in approval or fury. I couldn't tell. The vibration persisted, a low thrum through the deck that reminded me how close I had come to a disaster. The sea water at my boots churned and splashed with each gust of wind, and I could see the waves violently colliding with the rig's supports. The storm wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside, intertwined with the rig's machinery, the pipes, and the steel decks. My decision to respect Rule 5 had likely spared my life, but I understood the rig had noticed, and it would remember. I backed away toward the safety of the upper deck, keeping my hands away from any metal that seemed to pulse with residual energy from my near mistake. Each step was deliberate, my eyes flicking between the trembling pipes, the valve I had almost tampered with, and the storm raging beyond the steel walls. My ears caught every subtle groan of the rig, each vibration carrying the weight of warning. Dave's words echoed in my mind. Some mistakes are unforgivable, some just teach you to survive. I prayed I had done enough to be forgiven. When I finally reached the enclosed cabin, the lights inside felt like a sanctuary compared to the chaos outside. I sank against the wall, gasping, watching the rain lash the rig, and felt a shiver that had nothing to do with cold. The storm continued to batter the structure, but the rig's pulse seemed calmer now, almost satisfied that I had respected its boundaries. I realized that Rule 5 wasn't about machinery, it was about respect. The rig, alive in ways I was only beginning to grasp, demanded obedience, and storms were the moments when its awareness was strongest. I spent the rest of the night double-checking every valve, every pipe, every conduit I could reach without touching anything unusual. The storm outside roared, but inside I remained alert, haunted by the vibration still lingering in my palms and through the steel floors. I understood now why these rules existed. Not for superstition, not for comfort, but because ignoring them invited forces the rig had been containing, waiting to punish, waiting to correct. I had tested that patience tonight, and I had been lucky. As dawn broke, the storm retreated slightly, revealing the gray, churning waves below and the steel skeleton of the rig trembling from the night's assault. I knew I would never again touch a valve during a storm, and the memory of the pipe's low vibration would haunt every inspection I performed from then on. Each rule, each warning, each previous scare, the reflections, the footsteps, the breathing pipes, had led me to this understanding. Rule 5 had been my test, and I had barely passed. I first learned Rule 6, never enter the submerged maintenance chambers alone. During a night when the rig felt like a ghost ship, every steel plate groaning under the relentless waves of the North Sea. After surviving the storm and the near disaster with the valves, I thought I understood the limits of danger on the rig. But the chambers below the waterline had a reputation all their own. They were sealed, claustrophobic spaces, partially flooded, and eerily silent, with only the faint hum of pressure regulators, reminding you that the sea pressed against the walls at thousands of pounds per square inch. No one went in alone, not because of procedure, but because no one returned unchanged when they did. That evening, I was tasked with checking the integrity of the secondary pressure conduits, a job that required stepping into the submerged maintenance area to inspect a series of valves and welds. The hatch hissed as I opened it, cold water dripping along the rim, and I felt the weight of the ocean pressing down immediately. The dim emergency lights reflected off the wet metal, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the walls. I knew the rule existed for a reason, but part of me thought I could manage. After all, I had survived everything else so far. Curiosity, or maybe arrogance, pushed me inside. The water in the chamber was waist deep, icy, seeping into every seam of my suit. As I stepped further, the narrow walkway seemed to elongate unnaturally, the walls bending slightly in the low light. The steel around me pulsed faintly, not mechanically, but with an almost perceptible heartbeat, echoing the vibrations from the pipes I had learned to fear. My flashlight beam cut through the dark water, revealing panels, conduits, and the occasional submerged tool left behind. Every sound echoed, every splash magnified, and the atmosphere pressed in like a living entity. I was midway through the inspection when I heard it. Slow, deliberate movement in the water behind me. My breath caught, chest tightening, and I froze, straining to see anything through the murky depths. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was something wet, fluid, and impossible to pinpoint. I told myself it was just the rig settling, maybe a trapped current inside the pipes, but instinct screamed otherwise. The submerged chambers were designed to keep water out, but this presence felt deliberate, aware that I had ignored the rule and entered alone. As I turned slowly, flashlight sweeping, I saw nothing at first, but the reflection in the steel panels distorted unnaturally, showing shapes that weren't mine. The water shimmered strangely around my boots, rippling in patterns that seemed intentional, almost communicative. My gloves, slick with condensation, slipped slightly on the railing as I reached to steady myself. The vibrations through the floor grew subtle but insistent, moving from foot to foot like a living pulse beneath the metal. Every instinct in my body screamed to retreat, but the narrow walkway and the weight of water slowed my movements to almost a crawl. I could feel the pressure of the ocean outside the chamber, pressing against the steel, but there was something else too, something alive within the rig itself. I remembered the warnings. The submerged maintenance chambers were the most dangerous places because the rig's awareness concentrated there. It could observe without being seen, interact without contact. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but when a shadow flickered across the panel next to me, I nearly dropped my flashlight. The beam wavered, and for a fraction of a second, I swore I saw a figure moving in the water, keeping pace with me. My heart pounded as I stepped forward, flashlight trembling in my hands. The water seemed to rise slightly with each movement, a subtle swell that I knew wasn't natural. I whispered under my breath, reminding myself that Rule 6 existed for a reason. Each time I approached a valve, the reflections in the steel seemed wrong, slightly delayed, like they were assessing me. The water ripples didn't match my movements. The sounds weren't in sync with my steps. And then I heard it again, the slow, deliberate steps of something else moving behind me, impossible to trace, yet undeniably present. I tried to hurry through the inspection, moving from panel to panel, carefully checking the welds and connections. But the deeper I went, the more the chamber seemed to expand, stretching longer than it should have been. The corners bending in ways steel shouldn't bend. The lights flickered, briefly plunging me into darkness, and when they returned, I felt the eyes of the rig, or whatever resided in these chambers, on me. A sudden surge of water hit my knees, stronger than any current could cause, and I stumbled, gripping the railing to keep from falling. My flashlight reflected off the steel again, and for a brief instant, I thought I saw a hand rising out of the water, but when I blinked, nothing was there. I realized then that the chambers were a test. Alone, you were vulnerable. The rig didn't need to harm you immediately. It only needed to see how you reacted, how you balanced fear and action. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to continue, moving with deliberate, cautious steps. The water at my boots sloshed softly, but the echo of movement behind me persisted, always just at the edge of perception. Every panel, every pipe, every shadow seemed to contain a presence, subtle, patient, unrelenting. By the time I finished the inspection and climbed the narrow ladder back toward the hatch, the water seemed calmer, almost compliant. But I knew it was temporary. The rig had marked me. It had assessed my reaction, cataloged my fear, and waited for the next time I might falter. When I finally emerged into the upper deck, the wind hitting my face felt like salvation. Dave met me at the hatch, his eyes narrowing as he assessed my expression. "You went in alone," he said simply, almost as if the rig itself had spoken through him. I nodded, unable to reply. I understood completely. I had survived, but only barely. Even hours later, in the safety of my quarters, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the presence of the water and steel lingering in my bones. I replayed every step, every ripple, every vibration in my mind. Rule 6 was clear, and I had broken it. I had been lucky, but the rig remembered. Every submerged maintenance chamber was a pocket of awareness, and I had trespassed without a partner, exposing myself to judgment. I knew that next time, if I were alone again, the outcome might not be so forgiving. The North Sea stretched gray and endless outside, waves smashing against the rig, but the real danger had never been outside. It had been inside the chambers, inside the steel, inside the awareness that lived in the metal and water alike. I lay awake that night, thinking about the subtle shifts in pressure, the reflections in wet steel, the faint vibrations underfoot. I had survived Rule 6, but I knew I had earned the rig's attention, and attention here is a dangerous thing, one that never forgets. I first understood Rule 7. Never open the emergency hatch without a partner. Watching on a night when the rig seemed unusually quiet, almost expectant, like the sea itself was holding its breath. After surviving the submerged chambers alone, I thought I had learned caution, but this rule carried a different weight entirely. The emergency hatches aren't just exits. They're interfaces between the rig and the void outside, doors that connect to compartments few dare to enter. Opening one alone is like signaling something in the rig that you are isolated, vulnerable, and ready for attention. That night, I was sent to inspect the hatch at the edge of the upper platform, a thin strip of steel jutting over the black North Sea. The wind tore at the rig with full force, whipping rain against my visor and lashing my suit. My gloves were slick from condensation, and the hatch's metal surface glinted under the dim floodlights. I knelt down to inspect the locking mechanism, aware of every groan and shudder of the rig beneath me. The air smelled of salt and machinery, sharp and metallic, and the darkness beyond the deck seemed to push inward, pressing against the walls like a living entity. I knew the rule existed for a reason. The emergency hatches are not just doors, they're thresholds. Thresholds that, when crossed alone, allow the rig to observe you fully, testing your resolve and your fear. As I released the first latch, a gust of wind nearly knocked me sideways, and I caught myself on the railing, heart hammering in my chest. The hatch shuddered in my hands, heavy with the pressure differential between the compartments and the open air. I remembered the old warning from the veteran mechanics: the rig notices, even when you think no one is watching. My reflection flickered faintly in the hatch's polished metal, and for a moment I hesitated, recalling the earlier rules, the reflection, the footsteps, the pipes. Everything seemed connected, as if the rig's awareness flowed through every surface, every vibration, every shadow. A sudden groan from the deck below made me start. The emergency hatch seemed to resist, the handle cold and stubborn in my grip. My breathing came in short, tense bursts, echoing oddly against the metal surfaces. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see Dave or another team member standing nearby, but the deck was empty. I felt the weight of the rig's observation pressing down, the silence of the night amplifying every creak, every shiver in the steel. For the first time, I realized that breaking Rule 7 didn't just risk my life, it risked something far more insidious: the rig's calculated attention. I tried to step back, forcing my mind to rationalize the moment, to remind myself that I had survived previous tests, that caution had kept me alive, but the hatch seemed to resist being closed. As if aware of my hesitation, aware that I was alone, my gloves slid on the handle again, the metal slick from the condensation and the rain. The wind carried the faintest whisper of movement across the deck, subtle but deliberate, like something pacing just out of sight. My stomach turned. I could feel the rig's presence in every fiber of the platform, in every vibration beneath my boots. The hatch gave a small, reluctant hiss as I finally lifted it, revealing a narrow access tunnel descending into the bowels of the rig. Darkness swallowed the passage, and the faint echo of dripping water resonated like a heartbeat in the void. I instinctively froze, listening, knowing that opening it alone invited observation from the unseen awareness that lingered in these spaces. I thought about the submerged chambers, the reflections, the pipes. I understood now that these rules were not arbitrary. They were survival. Every rule was a safeguard against something patient, something that watches, something that knows when you're alone. I forced myself to take a cautious step forward, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting a narrow path into the darkness. Each step echoed through the tunnel, amplified unnaturally by the confined metal. The wind from above seemed to reach in, tugging at my suit, reminding me that the hatch was not just a door but a threshold to the rig's core awareness. I tried to rationalize, telling myself the passage was empty, but the shadows shifted oddly in the light, as if the walls themselves were breathing. My hand brushed the wet steel, and a faint vibration ran through it, subtle but undeniable, as if the rig were warning me to turn back. Halfway down the passage, I paused, flashlight sweeping over the conduits and piping. The reflection of the metal seemed wrong, stretched and distorted, unlike anything I had seen before. My heart hammered as I realized that even though the hatch was open, the rig's awareness had found me. It could observe, assess, and interact without needing to touch. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to close the hatch and wait for a partner, but the staircase leading further down was steep, slick, and tempting in its promise of completing the inspection. I swallowed hard, fingers tightening on the flashlight, remembering Rule 7 and the consequences of ignoring it. A sudden subtle vibration ran along the floor, moving in tandem with my own steps, though I was certain of its unnatural origin. The echo of dripping water, the shifting shadows, and the low hum of the rig itself pressed against my nerves. My breathing grew shallow as I understood the danger. The rig was aware of my isolation, measuring my fear, testing my obedience. A single mistake, a single misstep, and the consequences would not be mechanical failure, they would be far worse. The hatch above me seemed to loom like a sentinel, a reminder that rules exist to protect us from awareness we cannot see, from forces we cannot measure. I backed carefully toward the hatch, keeping the beam of the flashlight focused on every surface, every shadow, every pipe that might conceal movement. The sound of the wind above mixed with faint groans of the structure, and I could almost feel the unseen eyes following me, analyzing, judging. I reached the hatch, pressed my back against the steel, and slowly closed it, the latch clicking into place with a finality that felt like a release of tension from the rig itself. Relief washed over me, but the memory of the passage, the darkness, and the weight of observation remained. Dave was waiting above when I emerged, expression tight, eyes wary. He didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. He had seen the signs in the past, knew what it meant when a hatch was opened alone. "You know why that rule exists," he said softly, and I nodded, still trying to steady my breathing. I understood completely. Rule 7 was about survival, about respect, about acknowledging the rig's awareness. Alone, you are vulnerable. Alone, you are a target. The rig watches, it waits, and it punishes errors quietly, but irreversibly. Even after the storm outside calmed and the deck lights reflected normally off the steel, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hatch had shown me something beyond routine inspection. Something patient, something intelligent, something that had assessed me, measured my fear, and marked me. Rule 7 was no longer just words in a handbook, it was a lifeline. One mistake in the rig's awareness, one moment of isolation, and the consequences could be permanent. That night, I realized the emergency hatches were more than exits. They were gateways, and opening them alone invited attention from forces I was only beginning to understand. I first learned Rule 8, never ignore the pressure alarms, even when they seem false. On a night when the rig's steel frame creaked like it was speaking, and the wind and waves of the North Sea combined into a deafening roar outside. After surviving the submerged chambers and narrowly respecting the emergency hatch, I thought I understood the limits of danger on the rig, but the pressure alarms taught me otherwise. They are not just sensors, they are the rig's voice. a subtle communication of its awareness. And ignoring them is like turning your back on something alive and intelligent. That night, the alarms began softly, a distant pulsing thrum that could have been dismissed as a glitch, but instinct screamed it was not. I was halfway through checking the auxiliary lines on the lower deck when the first alarm sounded, a faint vibration that seemed to run through the steel beneath my boots. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at the control panel. All readings appeared nominal, everything within expected ranges. Still, the alarm continued, a rhythmic, insistent pulse that seemed to grow louder with each second. I hesitated. My fingers itched to silence it, to label it as a false positive, but something in the vibrations, in the way the pipes hummed in response, told me that dismissing it would be a mistake. The rig itself seemed to tense around me, anticipating my next move. As I approached the source, a low metallic groan accompanied the alarm, echoing down the corridor and into the farthest corners of the deck. The steel walls pulsed subtly, an almost imperceptible shift that conveyed urgency. I could feel the vibrations in my palms as I gripped a nearby railing, and I realized that the alarm was not just a warning, it was an appeal, a way for the rig to communicate a growing threat. The earlier lessons of reflections, footsteps, pipes and hatches replayed in my mind, each one teaching me that the rig's awareness extends far beyond mechanical readings. Obedience is survival. I took a deep breath and began to follow the alarm, moving cautiously down the corridor toward the pressure control chamber. The narrow walkway felt alive, as though the metal beneath me was subtly shifting in tandem with the alarm's pulse. My gloves squeaked against the railing, echoing faintly in the tense silence between the alarm's pulses. I reminded myself to stay calm, to analyze the readings without panicking, yet the faint presence of the rig, its intelligence, seemed to press against my senses, forcing my awareness into hyperfocus. Ignoring Rule 8 was no longer a hypothetical risk. It was a tangible pressing danger. The control chamber's door groaned as I pushed it open, water dripping from the ceiling in fine rivulets that glistened under the flickering emergency lights. Inside, the alarm source became apparent. A secondary conduit had developed a subtle, irregular pressure spike. Mechanically, it seemed minor, nothing catastrophic, but I knew better. The rig doesn't create alarms without cause. Even a seemingly insignificant fluctuation can signal something far worse when the metal itself is aware. The pulse of the alarm echoed against the walls, moving almost rhythmically through the conduits, like a heartbeat warning me that this was more than a mechanical problem. I knelt to examine the valve, feeling the vibrations transfer through my gloves as I traced the pipeline. My flashlight illuminated the wet steel, revealing subtle distortions along the joints, faint warping that seemed impossible to be caused by normal pressure alone. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but the rules, and my experience, demanded inspection. I realized the rig was observing every gesture, every reaction, judging my compliance and my understanding of the danger. The pulse of the alarm intensified slightly, as if testing my resolve, and I felt the weight of its scrutiny pressing into my shoulders. A sudden sharper alarm chimed, louder than before, reverberating through the chamber and up the deck. I jerked upright, flashlight swinging, and saw the metal around the valve shiver faintly, almost as if alive. My heart raced as I traced the pipeline further, discovering a hairline crack along a seam, tiny but consequential. If ignored, it could escalate quickly, amplified by the rig's own sentience and the pressure of the sea outside. I realized the alarms had not been false. They had been precise, subtle, demanding attention before a disaster could escalate. My hesitation had already cost me tense moments, and I could feel the rig reminding me why Rule 8 exists. I spent the next hour carefully monitoring the chamber, adjusting the valves under the guidance of the rig's subtle cues. Every time I moved, the vibration shifted, a living feedback from the metal, ensuring I didn't miscalculate. The pressure stabilized slowly, and the alarm's pulse softened, returning to the quiet hum of a vigilant rig. My hands were damp, my gloves slick, and my muscles ached from holding tension, but I understood the lesson. the alarms were not merely signals. They were warnings from something intelligent, something alive, something that judged obedience as survival. Even after the pressure normalized and the alarms fell silent, I remained on edge. Every vibration underfoot, every subtle groan from the pipes, reminded me that ignoring Rule 8 could have been fatal. I checked the readings again and again, unwilling to trust the rig's quiet for long. I realized that the seemingly mundane tasks, monitoring pressure, checking valves, were exercises in awareness and respect. The rig's intelligence is patient, but it punishes those who fail to heed its subtle signals. That night, the alarms taught me more about survival than any reflection, pipe, or submerged chamber ever had. As I made my way back to the upper deck, the North Sea wind striking against my visor, I understood that the rig's rules were interconnected. Each previous ordeal, the reflections, the footsteps, the pipes, the emergency hatch, culminated here. The alarms were not just mechanical warnings, they were extensions of the rig's awareness, communicating directly with anyone who would listen. I knew that if I had ignored them, even briefly, the consequences might have been irreparable. I had survived, but the lesson was seared into my consciousness. Obedience to Rule 8 is not optional. By dawn, the storm outside had eased, leaving only a gray churning sea and a trembling rig beneath the rising sun. I double-checked every pressure gauge, every pipeline, every valve I could reach, and even then, I couldn't shake the sense that the rig was still observing, cataloging, waiting. The subtle vibrations in the deck and the low hum of the machinery reminded me of the intelligence that flowed through the steel. I had survived Rule 8, but I knew the rig had marked me, storing every hesitation, every second of doubt. Survival wasn't just about following the rules. It was about earning the rig's quiet respect. I first understood Rule 9. Never enter the night watch room without logging your presence. On a night when the rig felt suffocatingly still, as if the North Sea itself had frozen around us. After surviving the pressure alarms, I thought I had mastered caution, but the night watch room had its own brand of vigilance. It wasn't just a place to monitor systems. It was the rig's nerve center, a space where absence or unrecorded presence could trigger awareness from the structure itself. That night, my task was simple: check the security logs, ensure the monitors were functioning, and return. But simple tasks on this rig often hide unseen dangers. The corridor leading to the night watch room was dimly lit, the hum of machinery beneath my boots, punctuated by the faint echo of my footsteps. I hesitated at the doorway, remembering the rule. Logging your presence was more than a formality. It was a signal to the rig that you acknowledged its intelligence and were following its protocols. Ignoring it, even once, could invite something I wasn't prepared to face. My hand hovered over the access panel, hesitating. I could feel the rig's subtle pulse through the steel floor, a low vibration warning me that the consequences of misstep were immediate and serious. Inside the room, monitors flickered faintly, displaying feeds from cameras along the rig. Everything seemed normal, mechanical, predictable, but the silence was heavy, almost oppressive. I moved toward the terminal to log my presence, and as my fingers brushed the keys, a faint hum pulsed through the walls. I froze, the sound low and deliberate, as if the rig itself was observing, judging my hesitation. The pulse seemed to travel through the room, brushing along the cables, the panels, the steel walls. I realized the night watch room was not merely a control point. It was an observation chamber, capable of perceiving presence beyond mechanical systems. I glanced around, noting the subtle reflections in the monitors and steel surfaces. They weren't quite right. Shapes stretched where they shouldn't, shadows flickering in angles impossible for the lighting. My breath caught as I approached the log terminal, realizing that failing to register my presence might alert something within the rig. I tapped the keys, entering my credentials, heart hammering with every keystroke. The rig's subtle vibrations seemed to soften, almost in approval, as though acknowledging my compliance. Even this small act, the simple logging of presence, felt like survival. Suddenly, a faint movement caught my eye from the corner of the room. I turned quickly, flashlight sweeping across the monitors. Nothing, yet the hum in the walls persisted, growing stronger for a moment, then fading. I felt the rig's awareness pressing in closer, subtle but undeniable, a presence behind the reflective surfaces that I could not pinpoint. I reminded myself of the rule again, Rule 9, and knew that obeying it was not about procedure. It was about keeping the rig's attention from turning hostile. My hesitation could cost more than time. It could cost control over the rig's perception of me. As I continued my inspection, the monitors flickered briefly, showing angles I hadn't expected, corridors I didn't recognize. I felt a cold pressure brush the back of my neck, and instinctively I spun, but the room remained empty. My heartbeat raced, and the silence returned, heavy and oppressive. It occurred to me that the Night Watch room was more than a command center. It was a nexus of awareness. By logging my presence, I acknowledged its observation, confirming that I understood my place and my boundaries. Failing to do so might invite a presence to manifest in ways I couldn't anticipate. Minutes later, I finished the routine check and glanced at the log terminal again. Everything seemed in order, but the faint hum persisted through the walls and floor. I could feel the rig vibrating subtly beneath my boots, not mechanically, but with intent. It was an approval, a reminder, and a warning all at once. The rig's intelligence was patient, and the Night Watch room tested that patience in subtle ways. Each rule I had followed so far culminated here, proving to the rig that I respected its awareness and understood the stakes. I left the room slowly, flashlight in hand, every step careful and deliberate. The corridor outside felt narrower, the shadows longer, as though the rig stretched space to test my composure. Every vibration, every hum, every subtle groan reminded me of the unseen presence that had marked my actions. The Night Watch room had observed, cataloged, and judged. I understood that obeying Rule 9 was not optional. It was the line between compliance and attracting attention that the rig did not forget. By the time I reached the upper deck, the wind outside felt like a relief, lashing against the rig and reminding me of the North Sea beyond. But the sensation of being observed lingered, heavier now, a quiet pressure in my chest and shoulders. I understood the lesson. The Night Watch room was not simply a workspace. It was a sentinel, a conscious point of awareness, and every entry without logging presence would be noticed. Survival depended on acknowledgement, obedience, and respect for its vigilance. Even hours later, as I tried to sleep in the cramped quarters, I could feel faint vibrations in the steel floor, reminders of the rig's sentience and the eyes that observed from every reflective surface. Rule 9 had been more than a guideline, it was a necessity. Ignoring it, even momentarily, would have consequences I was only beginning to comprehend. The rig remembers every hesitation, every misstep, and it waits patiently for the next test. I had survived the Night Watch room, but only because I obeyed the rule. I learned a long time ago that Rule 10, never lean over the water. After midnight is not a warning about falling, slipping, or losing balance. It's about something else. Something that knows when you're close. Something that waits just below the surface with a patience that feels older than the rig itself. The first time the seniors told me this rule, I thought it was a joke, another exaggeration made to spook the rookies during night shifts. But the first time I worked past midnight on the western deck, I understood why they spoke with tight jaws and avoided eye contact. The water changes after midnight, becomes heavier, quieter, like it's listening. You don't lean over it. You don't even get too close. The ocean around the rig is already a disturbed thing. Industrial noise, vibrations, heat, lights piercing depths that were never meant to be seen. But after midnight, when the top decks go silent and the generators settle into a low, almost living hum, the water becomes unnaturally still. It reflects light in a way that feels wrong, lacking the normal ripple of waves. The surface looks like black glass, perfectly smooth, except for the occasional disturbance that isn't caused by wind or current. It's subtle, but the experienced guys know how to see it. The faint swirl that forms as though something massive just drifted closer from below. Most nights, nothing happens. You follow the rule, keep your distance, and pretend the ocean is just water. But every so often, someone makes a mistake. Maybe they drop a tool, maybe they hear something, maybe curiosity wins. And every time someone leans over the railings after midnight, the water reacts with a sudden movement, a violent disruption, as if something was waiting just beneath the surface for that exact moment, that exact angle of vulnerability. The first recorded incident on our rig happened 10 years ago, long before I got here. A mechanic named Harrow leaned over the starboard side to check a noise in the pipes. The cameras caught the whole thing, though the footage is never shown to new employees. I only saw it because the chief engineer trusted me, or maybe wanted to scare discipline into me. At first, the footage shows Harrow leaning forward, his flashlight beam sweeping over the water. The ocean is motionless. Then out of nowhere, something pushes upward from below. Not a creature, not a wave, just displacement. A huge rapid surge, like a giant breath being exhaled underwater. It knocks him off balance, and he falls in. They found him 20 minutes later on the opposite side of the rig, unconscious, floating face up, but with terror still frozen on his face. He survived, but he never worked nights again. He also refused to describe what he saw the moment before he blacked out. After seeing that footage, I never questioned Rule 10 again. A few weeks ago, I had my own encounter, the closest I've come to breaking the rule. It was 12:37 a.m., a calm night, no wind, no vibrations from drilling. I was walking the perimeter for my scheduled round when I heard something. Not a splash, not machinery. It was a voice, faint, distant, but unmistakably human. It didn't call my name, but it had the pleading tone of someone needing help. I froze. Training says ignore it. The water mimics sound sometimes, especially at night. But this sounded real, close, desperate. I forced myself to step back from the railing. I kept repeating Rule 10 in my head, treating it like a mantra, but then something scraped against the metal support beam beneath me. Slow, dragging, deliberate. My flashlight shook in my hand as I leaned slightly, just enough to angle the beam downward without actually bending over. The light hit the surface, and the reflection made my stomach flip. The water wasn't still anymore. It had formed a perfect circular ripple beneath my feet, as though the ocean was breathing upward. Something enormous was directly below me, pushing the water aside with slow movements I could see but not understand. And then it rose, not to the surface, but close enough that the blackness developed depth, shape, and motion. I didn't see eyes or a body. I saw an outline, a presence, something impossibly large drifting just under the reflective skin of the sea. As I stepped back, the voice called again, this time clearer, undeniably human, undeniably close. It sounded like someone drowning, yet no one was in the water. The moment I crossed the yellow safety line, the water smoothed out again, the voice stopped, and whatever had been beneath me sank slowly downward, the circular ripple fading into perfect stillness. No one believed me at first. They said exhaustion can play tricks on your senses, but when I described the ripple, the shape, the sound, the depth, the chief engineer's eyes widened slightly. He didn't say anything at first. Then he told me a story I wasn't supposed to hear. Years ago, divers had been doing maintenance at 2 a.m. They were suspended in a cage, never touching open water, always insulated. But halfway through the shift, one diver heard a voice from the dark below calling his name, his full name, in his mother's voice. He panicked, started kicking the sides of the cage, trying to climb out. His partner and the operator managed to calm him down, but he quit the next day. He insisted something huge was circling them, something that knew who he was. Since then, Rule 10 became the final rule taught to newcomers, the oldest, the most serious, the only rule that the veterans refused to joke about. I've asked myself many times why the ocean changes after midnight. What stirs beneath it? what listens, what waits. But I've never asked out loud, not anymore. Some mysteries are better left untouched. All I know is this: once the clock passes midnight, the water isn't water anymore. It's a threshold, a mirror, a hungry surface that notices when you come too close. And it doesn't matter how strong you are, how careful you think you're being, or how quick your reflexes are. If you lean over the edge, if your body shifts even a few inches past the safe line, whatever lives under the rig will rise, silently, patiently, purposefully. Rule 10 exists for a reason. Never lean over the water after midnight. I first understood Rule 11. Never touch the pipes that knock back on a night when the North Sea wind howled like a living thing, and the rig shivered beneath the relentless waves. By the time I reached the maintenance deck, I had survived storms, submerged chambers, emergency hatch tests, pressure alarms, and the haunting night watch room. Each previous rule had been a lesson in patience, obedience, and respect for the rig's awareness. But Rule 11 was different. The pipes weren't just conduits for oil or water. They were conduits of presence, memory, and something far older than any human on board. They had a pulse, a subtle resistance, a reaction when you dared to interact with them in ways you shouldn't. It started innocuously. I had been assigned to inspect the secondary pipeline section on the lower deck, where the pipes ran in a tangle of steel and insulation. The routine inspection was simple: check for corrosion, ensure the supports were secure, report any anomalies. But as my gloves brushed against the chilled metal, I felt it, a faint vibration that wasn't mechanical. The pipe beneath my hand shuddered lightly, as if alive. My instincts screamed to step back, yet curiosity gnawed at me. I remembered the rule whispered among the veterans: touching the pipes invites attention. Not accidents, not simple malfunctions. Attention, aware, conscious attention. I tried to dismiss the sensation, blaming it on the residual storm tremors or the vibration from the rig's generators. But then the pipe responded again, stronger this time, pulsing beneath my palm in a way that mimicked a heartbeat. My mind raced, recalling the rules, the reflections, the night watch room, the submerged chambers. Everything was interconnected. Every violation or misstep had consequences. I pulled back slightly, but my fingers had already lingered too long. The vibration intensified, traveling through the metal into my gloves, up my arms, into my chest. A subtle warning that I couldn't ignore. A low hum emerged, not from machinery, but from the pipes themselves. It was almost communicative, rhythmic, deliberate. I heard the memory of past mistakes, past violators embedded in the metallic pulse. The pipes seemed to know my history, my hesitation, the nights I had survived by following rules. Yet they also sensed my curiosity, my temptation to test limits. I felt a twinge of dread, understanding that Rule 11 was the culmination of every lesson I had learned. To touch was not merely to inspect, it was to invite judgment, to challenge the awareness embedded in the rig's steel veins. I attempted to step away, but as I did, the vibration followed, trailing my motion along the interconnected pipe network. Each segment I passed hummed in response, not like mechanical resonance, but as if alive, aware of my presence and my movements. My flashlight beam caught reflections of the pipes, twisted and warped in angles that should have been impossible, distorting like liquid steel. I realized the pipes weren't just conduits for fluids or pressure. They were conduits for consciousness. They remembered every hand, every breath, every misstep along their length. The longer I stood there, the more the vibrations grew insistent, almost aggressive. I felt a tug against my gloves, subtle but undeniable, like a warning from something alive inside the steel. The air seemed heavier, pressing down against my suit, my chest, making it hard to breathe. I whispered to myself, reminding myself of every previous rule, every test I had survived. Even the North Sea storm that had once threatened to throw me off the rig seemed like a gentle precursor compared to this silent, patient judgment flowing through the pipes. Suddenly, A sharp, almost violent pulse traveled through the nearest pipe, startling me so that my gloves slipped. My heart thundered, adrenaline spiking, as the vibration ricocheted through the deck. I froze, feeling the pulse move in waves along the metal, converging where I had touched. The pipes knocked back, not physically, but energetically, as though the rig itself was correcting my transgression. My instincts screamed to step away entirely, to retreat and never return, but a part of me was frozen, entranced by the silent intelligence in the metal. I realized then that these pipes were the rig's final test, the ultimate measure of obedience. Storms, alarms, submerged chambers, emergency hatches, all led to this moment. The pipes were patient, aware, and unrelenting. They required respect and distance. They demanded compliance without question. To touch them was to invite a force beyond mechanical repair, a judgment beyond human understanding. My hands shook as I lifted them from the metal, feeling the residual pulse lingering, watching, recording. Rule 11 was clear. The pipes do not forgive, they do not forget, and they remember everything. I backed toward the walkway, careful not to brush any more of the pipes, the vibrations slowly fading with distance, but leaving a deep impression in my mind. Each segment seemed to exhale a low hum, settling back into a quiet rhythm, but the knowledge remained. The rig had observed, assessed, and marked me. Even though I had survived the night, I understood that this rule was the culmination of every other obedience, awareness, patience, and respect for the rig's intelligence. By the time I reached the upper deck and felt the wind from the North Sea against my visor, I realized the gravity of my actions. Every previous lesson, every reflection, every pressure alarm, every night watch room visit, every midnight observation of the water, all had led to this. The pipes were living reminders, sentinels embedded in steel, enforcing rules that were older, more patient, and more relentless than any human could comprehend. Rule 11 was the rig's final message: touch nothing, obey completely, or face consequences that are subtle, patient, and permanent. Even now, after hours of cleaning, documenting, and reporting, I can feel the hum of the pipes in my memory, the residual pulse lingering under my skin. The rig's steel frames, its conduits, its flooded chambers, and reflective surfaces all resonate together. Every vibration is an echo of intelligence that I have learned to respect. I know that I survived Rule 11 tonight, not because I was strong, clever, or lucky, but because I finally understood obedience as survival. The pipes knocked back, not with violence, but with inevitability, and I heeded their warning. The night passed quietly afterward, but I will never forget the sensation of those conduits alive beneath my hands, responding to touch, asserting presence, demanding vigilance. The rig had tested me through 10 other rules, each building to this apex. The pipes were patient, intelligent, and unyielding. I had learned, finally, the true meaning of respect and fear on the rig. There is no ignoring Rule 11, no testing its limits, no questioning the consequences. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.